The bucket was already half full when I got down there. Ping, ping, ping. It's February. Cold the way old basements are cold. Not from wind, but from the earth itself pressing in through poured concrete walls. The smell is that specific combination of rust and wet mineral that you only know if you've inherited something old. A house, maybe. Or a problem that someone decided to leave for later. I'm on one knee next to a cast iron elbow joint. Original pipe. 1947, same year the house was built. My grandfather installed it, or had it installed, and for 70-some years it held. Then it didn't. The rust had been bleeding down the fitting. For months. A reddish-brown stain that spread like a bruise across the concrete floor, and I'd been watching it spread and doing math in my head that I didn't like. In my hand is a small glass bottle, amber-tinted, no brand name on the label. I transferred the liquid myself from a larger container I ordered online. Maybe $2 worth of what's inside, maybe less. I want to be very clear about what happened next. The drip stopped. Not slowed, stopped. And that basement, which had been keeping its own wet little rhythm for the better part of a year, went quiet. 12 American states have now restricted the residential sale of what's in this bottle. I want to tell you what it is, why it works, how it disappeared from hardware store shelves so quietly that almost nobody noticed, and what it cost me, in total, for a repair that the last plumber quoted at $4,600 to fix a leak that 3 separate professionals had called unfixable without major surgery. But to get there, I need to take you back about 8 months. Because this story starts not with a solution. It starts with the specific, grinding feeling of being told by an expert that you have no good options. The house came to me through my grandfather's estate. 1947, bungalow 2 blocks from a rail yard in a small Ohio city that had spent the last 30 years slowly learning to live with less. The structure was sound. The bones, as people say, were good. What the bones were attached to was a nervous system of original cast iron and galvanized steel pipe that had spent 7 decades doing exactly what it was designed to do and had finally, as all things do, reached the limit of that design. The leak started under the kitchen sink, a slow seep at a compression fitting, the kind of thing you catch with paper towel and tell yourself you'll get to. I got to it, tightened the fitting. It stopped for 3 weeks, then started again, then got worse, and by the time I realized it wasn't just that one joint, there were water stains appearing on the basement ceiling directly below. The first plumber came in March. He was thorough, I'll give him that. He spent 40 minutes under the house with a flashlight, came back up with the look that contractors get when they've already done the math, and know you won't like the answer. $480 for a temporary patch on the main elbow joint. Not a fix, he said. A pause. The pipe was compromised along a 6-inch run, and the smart money was on replacing the whole section eventually. I paid for the patch. By June, it was leaking again. The second plumber was younger, more confident, and wanted $1,200 to replace a single section of pipe, a job he estimated at 4 hours. He said the old patch compound had failed because the cast iron had corroded past the point where surface treatments held. He said this like it was a simple fact of the universe, the way gravity is a fact, and I nodded and said I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 months. The leak thought about nothing. It just kept leaking. The third plumber, and I want to be fair here because he was genuinely professional and not trying to take advantage of anyone. The third plumber walked through the whole basement, looked at every joint in a 70-foot run of original pipe, and told me the honest truth, as he understood it. The system was at end of life. The repairs were going to compound, and if I was going to spend money, I should spend it on repiping the whole basement run rather than chasing individual failures for the next 5 years. His estimate? $4,600. Labor and materials? Probably a week of disruption. What I felt in that moment wasn't anger. It was something quieter than anger. It was the feeling of being cornered by knowledge I didn't have enough of to question. He might have been right. He probably was right, in some sense of the word. But I didn't have $4,600 sitting idle, and I didn't have the expertise to say yes or no with any confidence. And so I thanked him, and he left. And I went back downstairs and sat on the 3rd step from the bottom with a flashlight and listened to the pipe drip into the bucket in the dark. That's the moment I started paying a different kind of attention. The notebook was in a cardboard box in the attic, wedged between a broken oscillating fan and 3 decades of Christmas ornaments in faded boxes. Leather cover cracked at the spine. My grandfather's handwriting on the inside front cover. His name, the address, and the year he bought the house, 1953. He'd kept records? That was the thing. Meticulously, without anyone asking him to, for 36 years. Every repair, every material, every cost, cross-referenced against the season and sometimes the weather. A new roof in 1967. Shingles from a Worcester supplier, labor done by a man named Calvert, who he noted charged fairly. A furnace replacement in 1974. Window glazing. Gutter work. The kind of documentation that nobody keeps anymore. because we've decided that expertise belongs to professionals, and homeowners are just the people who write the checks. Near the back, folded twice and tucked between the pages for 1961, was a single sheet of lined notebook paper. October 14th, 1961. A list of repairs. And near the bottom, underlined twice in ballpoint pen, the kind of underlining that means, remember this. A description of how he'd sealed a leaking joint in the boiler room. The mixture he'd used was simple enough that I read it twice to make sure I hadn't missed something. The core of it was a liquid he referred to by a name I half recognized. Water glass. Sodium silicate. Margin note in his careful hand. $0.40 at Betts Hardware. Lasted 22 years. Checked 1983. 22 years. From a 40-cent bottle. I went to the internet. I searched for sodium silicate, for water glass, for pipe leak sealer. The chemistry came up quickly. It's not a secret compound, not an obscure industrial formula. It's been documented since the 19th century. Used in food preservation, in foundry casting, in paper manufacturing, in concrete hardening. Widely, cheaply, openly available. And then I found the restriction notices, buried in state regulatory addenda and hardware supplier compliance documents. The kind of language nobody reads unless they're looking for it. 12 states had imposed restrictions on the residential sale of certain concentrations of sodium silicate for plumbing applications, beginning in the early 2000s. The specific concern, misuse. People pouring it into active drain systems or live water lines, where it could crystallize indiscriminately and cause blockages or damage to septic systems downstream. The restriction was narrow. The effect on availability was not. Sodium silicate is not exotic. It is, depending on who you ask, one of the most industrially versatile inorganic compounds ever put to regular use. The chemistry is old. German patents filed in the 1860s, though the material had been produced in various forms well before that. By the early 20th century, it had accumulated an almost absurd range of applications. Egg preservation. Farmers submerged fresh eggs in water glass, solution to extend their shelf life through winter. Fire-resistant coatings on wood and fabric. A binding agent in foundry work for holding sand molds together. A sealant for cracked masonry. A hardener for concrete floors. The U.S. Navy used it during the Second World War for emergency patching of hull breaches. Not ideal, not permanent in every case, but fast and effective enough that it belonged in the kit. Railroad maintenance crews had been carrying it since the 1920s for sealing steam fittings. By mid-century, it was in the plumbers' standard inventory alongside flux and pipe compound and oakum, sold by the gallon at general stores, listed in Sears Roebuck catalogs, available unremarkably to anyone who needed it. Why it works on pipe leaks specifically comes down to what happens when it contacts water carrying dissolved calcium, which is nearly all municipal water. When sodium silicate solution enters a crack and meets calcium ions, it undergoes a chemical exchange. The sodium swaps for calcium, and the resulting calcium silicate is insoluble. It crystallizes, not as a coating on the pipe surface, but inside the crack itself. A mineral seal that forms in the void where the leak originates, occupying the space the water was using to escape. The material that forms is chemically similar to the silicate minerals found in volcanic rock. It doesn't flex, but it doesn't need to. It fills. By the 1980s, sodium silicate had largely disappeared from the consumer aisle, not all at once, not with any announcement. It simply ceased to be the thing you reached for. The shelf space it had occupied filled with other products. Branded, packaged, marketed. Epoxy putty sticks in blister packs. 2-part resin compounds with proprietary names and instructions printed in 4 languages. Flexible repair tape. Leak stop compounds in brightly colored tubes. Every product making slightly different promises, all of them priced between $15 and $60 for quantities that would handle 1, maybe 2 repairs. I stood in the plumbing aisle of a large hardware chain a few months into this investigation and counted 14 distinct branded sealant products. Some for PVC, some for cast iron, some described as universal. Not a single one of them was sodium silicate. I asked the department associate if they carried water glass. He searched the system, found nothing, and suggested I try the pool chemical section. The pool chemical section did not have it either. I ordered it online. Industrial supply vendor, 1 liter for under $3 with shipping. It arrived in a plain bottle, a clear, slightly syrupy liquid with a faint alkaline smell the color of very weak tea. I poured a small amount into a glass dish and left it to dry. Within 2 hours, it had formed a thin, hard, glass-like film, translucent, rigid, bonded to the glass dish so firmly I needed a scraper to remove it. I understood then why my grandfather had underlined it twice. On a Saturday in November, I turned off the water main at 9:14 in the morning. I know the exact time because I'd started keeping my own notebook by then, a small wire-bound thing I'd picked up at the drugstore, which felt right, somehow, continuous with something. I drained the line, Let it sit for 20 minutes to make sure the pressure was fully out of the system. Then I went to work on the joint. Wire brush first to strip the rust and the old patch compound down to bare iron. Then isopropyl alcohol on a rag, wiping the joint clean, getting into the seam where the fitting met the pipe. The grandfather's notebook had been specific about this. The surface needed to be clean for the silicate to bond properly in the first place, and he'd drawn a small diagram, the kind of thing an engineer would draw, patient and precise, showing the direction of application. I used a small syringe, the kind you'd use for epoxy injection, to work the sodium silicate into the crack. The material is thin enough to wick into tight spaces, and I could see it disappearing into the joint as I applied it, filling the void from the inside out. I applied it in 2 passes, waiting 10 minutes between them. Then I set a timer for 45 minutes and went upstairs. I didn't watch. I'd learned from 8 months of watching that waiting and watching are not the same thing, and that sometimes the only useful thing you can do is let chemistry work without supervision. When the timer went off, I went back down. The pipe looked the same. The silicate had dried to an almost invisible finish. No buildup, no visible patch, nothing that announced itself. I turned the water main back on slowly, watching the pressure gauge on the utility line climb from 0. The bucket was dry. The pipe was silent. I stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. I want to be honest about the limitations, because this is the part that tends to get omitted when someone has a story they're excited about. Sodium silicate is strongly alkaline. It will burn skin on contact if you leave it there, and you should treat it accordingly. Gloves, eye protection, the basic precautions you'd use with any caustic material. Certain plastics and synthetic rubber gaskets will degrade if they're exposed to it, which means it is not appropriate for every material in every plumbing system. PVC fittings, specifically, can be damaged by concentrated silicate solution. It was designed for iron, for ceramic, for masonry, materials that are chemically compatible with its alkalinity. And it should never, this matters, it should never be poured into an active water line or drain system. The restrictions that exist in 12 states exist for this exact reason. When sodium silicate is diluted and dispersed through a full plumbing system, it crystallizes inconsistently, potentially blocking drain lines or fouling septic systems downstream. Applied to a specific, isolated, drained leak site, it does what it's supposed to do. Applied carelessly to a running system, it creates different problems than the ones it's solving. There was a documented incident in a British industrial facility in the 1970s. A maintenance crew used silicate injection on a high-pressure boiler, fitting without fully depressurizing the system, and the thermal cycling caused uneven crystallization that eventually failed the seal catastrophically. The restriction on casual use is not without basis. The problem is not the chemistry. The problem is what happens when any chemistry is applied without understanding it. I'm saying this because I'm not interested in telling a story that flatters itself. The notebook my grandfather left behind was useful, not just because it named the compound, but because it described the method with the care of someone who'd thought about what could go wrong. I've thought about why this material faded from common use, and I've come to resist the most satisfying version of the answer. The most satisfying version involves deliberate suppression, manufacturers conspiring to replace cheap solutions with expensive ones, regulatory capture at the state level, a coordinated disappearance. That version is clean, it has antagonists, it explains everything. The version I actually believe is less dramatic and, in some ways, harder to sit with. Sodium silicate never got replaced by something better. It got replaced by something that photographed better on a retail shelf, came in packaging a purchaser could feel confident about, and carried a margin that made it worth advertising. The branded alternatives work. Most of them work reasonably well. They're just more expensive than they need to be, and their proliferation made a century-old solution effectively invisible to anyone who hadn't been told to look for it. What gets shelf space is what has been sold to the buyer at the store. What gets sold is what carries margin for the distributor. What carries margin is what gets reformulated, repackaged, relaunched with a new name every few years. A $2 compound that works for 22 years is, from a certain point of view, a poor business model. That's not a conspiracy. It's just an incentive structure, and incentive structures shape the physical world more reliably than any villain ever could. My grandfather understood this, I think, without needing to name it. The notebook was full of generic materials and methods, not because he was frugal, though he was, but because he'd come up in a time when the material and the method were the whole point, and brand names were just marketing. You could see through if you paid attention. I went back down to the basement this morning. 3 weeks since the repair. The chalk marks I'd made on the pipe, the grid pattern morning and night photographs for the first 72 hours, are still there, undisturbed by any moisture. The bucket is in the corner where I left it, dry as a held breath. The pipe joint looks like any other joint in the line. Nothing special, nothing that announces what happened there. The notebook is on the workbench. I've been adding to it. My own entries, my own methods, what worked and what didn't, and what cost what. It's thinner than his. I haven't had 60 years to fill it, but I've started. There's a line he wrote in October of 1961, just below the underlined repair entry, that I've been thinking about since I found it. He wrote, "The house knows what it needs. Pay attention, and it tells you." I don't know if that's wisdom exactly. Maybe it's just the kind of thing you write at the end of a Saturday when a 40-cent solution fixes a problem you'd been worrying about. But I've found it doing something to the way I walk through the house now, the way I listen to it. What sounds normal, what sounds aren't, what the pipes sound like when they're carrying water the way they should. It's quiet down there now. The kind of quiet that used to mean the bucket needed emptying. If your house was built before 1970 and it still has its original supply lines, you already live with the version of this problem that hasn't announced itself yet. The fix, if it comes to that, may be simpler and cheaper and older than anyone in a hardware store will think to tell you. And it's probably still on a shelf somewhere. You just have to know to ask for it by its older name. What year was your house built? Drop it in the comments. And if you've got original pipe still running, I want to hear about it.